Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, in our ongoing study in Jonathan Edwards and the Freedom of the Will. We're going to take a look at pages 40 to 74. We're going to take a look at the relationship of the understanding to the act of the will. The Arminians declared that the will is independently free, and Edwards is putting forth a position that the act of the will is always preceded by the understanding and is dependent upon the understanding. Let's begin with block 1. Take a look at the 3 moments of the mind. And Edwards begins, "Nothing comes to pass without a cause. Things have a foundation for their existence outside themselves." And he also says from existence we can argue that there must be an eternal, infinite, perfect being. He quotes Romans 1:20 from Paul, "The invisible things of him from the creation are clearly seen." So under act of the will, Edwards says there cannot be more in the effect than there is in the cause, and the ideas of the mind are consequences of past ideas, past sensations. The act of the will cannot come to pass without a prior cause. Contingency, which the Arminians say that the will is completely contingent, that is a falsehood, because the will is preceded by choice. Says Edwards, nothing comes to pass without a sufficient reason. Now, note 3, the act of nature is a general thing. It is a tendency of nature to act. It may be a cause as to why the soul acts, but not why the soul acts in a particular way. Soul has no influence on the diversity of effect. The first free act is always that of choice. Choice precedes volition. So under the act of choice, the mind is the designing cause of the will. Mind is designing cause. It has 3 steps. It is elective cause, as putting forth and enacting the enabling choice that it selects. It is active cause in the production of effects. Then the soul will excite the volition according to the choice that has been made. Choice always precedes volition. Choice always precedes volition. Therefore, he concludes in Block 1, Note 5, the Arminian position is inconsistent. The active nature of the soul cannot be the reason for the act of the will in itself, because it does not address why this particular act is in this manner rather than another. The will is not self-determining, because choice is always implied. There's always a foregoing free act of the will. There's always a preceding act of choice before the act of the will. So for Edwards, we must negate the Arminian heresy in Block 2. We must negate the Arminian heresy. So in Block 2 he begins, the act of the will, again, proceeds from choice. Self-determining power is nothing, must be negated. That is the Arminian position. The will is not a self-determining power. Free acts of the soul are directed by choice. There's always a prepondering inducement of the will. Then he discusses the setting of higher value. The will does not act in indifference, like the Arminians claim. The idea of the thing preferred is always considered in the mind. That creates a prevailing influence on the will. The steps of the mind unfold as general determination to act, and then a perception of determining that which is most clearly perceived, and then the choice focusing down to particularity. The mind is never indifferent in this process. Therefore, for Edwards, in Block 2, Note 3, we must negate the concept of indifference. The will does not act within an atmosphere of indifference. There's always prepondering inducement. Choice is based on what idea is most prevalent in the mind. The will is influenced by the prevailing inducement of reason. The attention of mind plays a significant role, because all ideas are not of equal strength. So under strength of ideas, Edwards tells us that time is perceived by the self through the changing of ideas. Every act has a prevailing inducement. Changes in the succession of ideas also have a cause. Choice becomes, first, a general review of the matter, second, a focusing down to particularity. So liberty cannot mean indifference. If you take a look at Block 2, Note 5, liberty of the will does not consist in indifference, as the Arminians say. It is impossible for the will to choose contrary to present understanding or present pondering. Any antecedent of prepondering destroys the notion of perfect indifference. Every free act must be done in a state of freedom. The will must be exerted in a state of freedom, and liberty must coexist with the act. But it is not an atmosphere of indifference, says Edwards. It is an act of the will that is always dependent on the understanding, always dependent on the faculty of choice. There is a necessary connection to the faculty of the understanding. So Edwards says negate the Arminian heresy, and then he gives us his conclusion in Block 3. Understanding is the preceding cause of the act of will. Nothing can come to pass without a cause. There you go. He said that again and again and again. The act of the will is never fully contingent. Every effect has a necessary connection with its cause. Underline necessary there. And that's the ground of its existence. Therefore, no event is fully contingent. Every event has some necessary connectedness to some prior cause. So under the faculty of understanding, in Note 2 there, Block 3, Note 2, every act of the will is connected with the understanding. The soul chooses that which appears most agreeable. The will never fails in its obedience to the understanding. Ideas of the mind govern the will. Ideas of the mind govern the will. The degree of understanding is increased through attention and through consideration. So under the degrees of understanding, what we choose is approved by the understanding, and the Spirit illuminates our understanding. That leads us to recognize and to possess a sense of obligation. That also increases the faculty of discernment. Determination of will must follow the illumination, the conviction, and the attention of the understanding. Determination of the will must follow the illumination, conviction, and attention of the understanding. Period. There's always that necessary connection. Therefore, he says in Note 4, illumination, conviction, and attention, God's operation and assistance is only moral, suggesting ideas to the understanding, and this view of understanding always precedes the act of the will. Always precedes the act of the will. And it's always something other than the will. The understanding is a separate faculty from the will. It is prior to. Intellect is prior to positing. Intellect is prior to positing. That's been proven in many phenomenologies we've already studied. So his conclusion, Block 3, Note 5, the dictate of the understanding is not the same as the dictate of the will. Therefore, liberty without all necessity is an impossible concept. The Arminian position makes all counsels, all instruction, all argument, all persuasions, which are inputs to the understanding, to be without value. the will does not function completely independent of the understanding. Period. The will does not function completely independent of the understanding. That is exactly what Edwards is saying here. Obviously, this lesson is a lesson on negation. Negation of the Arminian position, negation of concepts like self-determining power, concepts like indifference, concepts like liberty within indifference. All of that has to be negated. Independence from the understanding has to be negated. For Edwards, the act of the will is preceded by the sorting of the intellect. That fits in very well with every phenomenology we've studied thus far. It fits in perfectly with all of those lessons we've had on phenomenology. Intellect precedes positing. Intellect precedes positing. We've covered that many, many times. But he does give us in this lesson, he does address the moments of the mind, and he does say that there is an elective cause, which is that enabling choice that the intellect makes. Then it becomes active cause, and then the soul will excite the volition. But the intellect first creates that elective cause by choosing, by sorting ideas and choosing. Then that creates the elective cause, that tendency, that inertia, and that causes the soul to excite the faculty of volition. Then the intellect transitions to positing, or the act of the will. So there's always that elective cause, an active cause, and then the soul exciting the volition. That's his theoretical position in Block 1, and in Block 2 he gives us all of his negations. Negation of self-determining power, negation of indifference, negation of denying the fact that the fluidity of ideas or the changing of ideas plays a major role in how it informs volition. Liberty does not take place within the context of indifference. The act of the will is not a fully contingent act. So it gives us our theoretical position in Block 1. It gives us all of the negations in Block 2. And then he puts that together in a final conclusion in Block 3 by stating the axiom that the understanding proceeds as cause of the act of will. That becomes axiomatic for Edwards. It is a self-evident axiom for Edwards. The understanding is the preceding cause of the act of the will. Intellect precedes positing. That becomes an axiomatic truth for Edwards. But it gives us a great look at they're just 34 pages, pages 40 to 74. It's part 2, sections 3 through 10. But it does give us his negation lesson on negating the Arminian heresy, which, of course, he's picking up the Reformed position and taking the same stance. He was a Calvinist, and he's taking up the Calvinist stance, the Reformation stance, and saying that we have a fallen nature. We have a fallen will within the fallen nature. There is a doctrine of original sin, and that we cannot, of our own self-determining power, reach salvation. He takes up the Reformation position that salvation is by grace. It is God and God alone. We don't cooperate to gain salvation. We are given salvation through the act of grace, the grace of God through Christ. So Edwards gives us a great negation lesson here on negating the Arminian heresy. And we're going to be picking up next time in part 2, section 11, on page 75.